was reading through the comments the other day, and some woman commented that she didn't like my Okie accent. I wasn't sure what to think about that. What is an Okie? Is that someone from Oklahoma? That's not me. And if you listen to accents, you would know that I'm not a hillbilly. I'm not an Okie. I'm a Mississippi Delta River rat redneck. I'm just a redneck. This is the way we talk. I can't change it this late in my life, and I'm not really embarrassed of it. But we all sound normal around here when we talk to each other, so I just thought I would say I'm not an Okie, whatever an Okie is. Anyway, I've got a great story. It's a long story from Michigan. The writer calls it 94 Close-Up, November 13, 1993. I'm not sure what the 94 close-up means because the date is 1993. Anyway, this is a great story. I think you're going to enjoy it. All right, here we go. I was at the deer hunting and fishing cabin that my grandfather and my great-uncle Mick built after they came home from World War II. The cabin was in Glenny, Michigan on the All Sable River. I know I pronounced that wrong, but hang with me. I had gone up to the cabin the week before rifle season started so I could get in a week of bow hunting and cut some firewood and do some late season fishing and relax before Grandpa and Uncle Mick and Uncle Jim showed up for opening day of rifle season. I was born and raised in Arizona, and I had been an officer with one of the city departments for 5 years at the time of the incident. I took 3 weeks off every November to go to Michigan for deer season. I had been going to the cabin for years when I would visit when I was a kid. There were black bears around, but I had only ever actually seen one, but had seen tracks and scat a handful of times. I believe the most dangerous critters up there were the mosquitoes for the most part. There was nothing up there that would ever give me the heebie-jeebies, and I'm not prone to getting the creeps. I worked in a decent-sized city, so I was pretty well honed in on what real danger was, and I was pretty well stress inoculated by this time in my life. I was on my third day by myself. I hadn't been able to get into the woods to hunt because there was almost no firewood, and I spent the first 2 days cutting a deadfall pine and stacking it. I kept getting the feeling that I was being watched while I worked. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt or seemed like every time I turned my back to the encroaching woods 50 feet from the cabin, the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up. It wasn't a feeling I was unaccustomed to, but in the context of being at the cabin where I was always totally relaxed, it was out of the norm. But still, there was nothing identifiable, out of the ordinary, no strange sounds or smells, nothing that I could put my finger on, but I made sure I had my pistol on my belt when I was out and about, and this is something I just never did at the cabin, even if there was a bear track or a pile of scat. I never felt the need to be armed. I got the wood cut and stacked by late morning on the third day, and I went out to the front of the cabin, which was on the waterfront, and I put up a paper target on hay bales we use for verifying zero on our rifles and bows. The bales were to the left or the southeast and nearly to the wood line. I fired 5 rounds from my 30-30 rifle at 50 yards, which was actually a long shot for this area. The woods were so thick, a 25-yard shot on a deer was normal and often less because you flat couldn't see any further than 5 to 10 yards most places, except along the power lines that serviced the area. After I verified zero on my rifle, I fired 15 rounds at the same target with the 10mm Glock pistol I was actually planning on hunting with that year. My pistol was good to go too. I reloaded the pistol and the rifle. When I was cleaning up the brass, I heard a strange guttural oomph sound from inside the tree line behind me. The cabin was closed in by the woods on 3 sides, and there was only a half an acre cleared. So unless something was outside the tree line, you weren't going to see it. I thought it could have been a bear, and that didn't bother me. I'd been making plenty of noise, so it wouldn't be startled or surprised that I was there. I finished up and went in to get some food. Halfway back to the door, I heard the oomph again, only this time it was louder and it seemed to be closer. Well, now I was getting a creepy feeling about the whole thing, more than I had over the last couple of days. This was palpable, and then it hit me. I never heard a bear, a deer, a beaver, or any other critter make a sound with a definite F sound at the end. My cop brain went to, someone has to be messing with me. So I yelled out, "Okay, I hear you. This isn't a great place to be effing around. You better show yourself or get." Well, I heard the oomph again, and then definite heavy footfalls going away from where I was toward the back of the property to a swampy area behind the cabin. It wasn't really a swamp, but it was always wet and muddy, and if you tried to get in there, you were likely to lose a boot in the knee-deep mud and that sticky black silty soil. The footfalls were definitely heavy and bipedal. Again, my brain that looks for logical answers thought person in heavy hunting boots. But I also thought that whoever was messing with me was in for a nasty surprise if they went into that wet area. I figured it was a bow hunter or a young airman from the air base in Oscoda screwing around with me, which wasn't unusual in our area. I figured it was over, and I finally went inside the cabin through the screened-in porch at the front door and put my things away. I fixed lunch, and I half-dozed in a chair by the big fireplace. I had not been dozing long when a big boom startled me right out of my chair. I had no idea what the noise was, but I was on my feet. I thought it had to be one or two of the little A-7 jets from the airbase going low and fast over the river. They did that once in a while, and it could really shake the windows in our cabin because we were right on the water. I reoriented myself and realized I had to use the restroom. There was a bathroom in the cabin, but it had an old-style chemical toilet, and that was mainly for women when they came up. The men didn't use it because you had to empty it after every use, so we all used the outhouse out back for things that required a seat and a handy tree for business that could be done standing up. The only rule was that you had to step off the back porch. I decided I needed a seat, and I walked the 30 feet or so to the big outhouse, which faced out into the swamp, and I sat down to take care of business, and I heard the damn oomph again. Someone was definitely screwing around with me now, and I was getting pissed. I started back to the back porch cussing a blue streak. I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table, and I lit a cigarette, and I started a pot of coffee. I sat at the table drinking my coffee, and I cleaned my rifle and my pistol. I made a fire in the fireplace, and I put in a movie, and I had some dinner, and then I went to bed. The inside of the cabin, or the main part before the addition, was 24 feet by 24 feet. It was built from 10 to 12-foot logs, and the kitchen bumped out off the back, and there were 2 bedrooms, and the bathroom bumped out on the sides, and those were 2x6 framing. Nothing fancy, but it was comfortable. My bed was in the corner of the big room, right by one of the windows. On one wall was a big stone fireplace, and there were several comfortable chairs and 4 old freebie couches in different spots. Now, I usually sleep like a baby, but I tossed and turned. I think I was bent out of shape for being messed with and just generally irritated. When I finally couldn't sleep, I went back to the chair and I started another movie. And then came another boom, except it was more of a huge slap on the side of the cabin that made the whole wall shake. I grabbed my flashlight and my pistol and I headed out the front door. I heard fast footsteps going away from me, and I put the beam of light down that side of the cabin, but I couldn't see anything. I could hear it, but it was full dark, and unless you have been there at night, you don't know what dark is. Now I was seriously pissed. I was heated, but there wasn't anything I could do at that point. So I went back in and put in another movie, and at some point, I fell asleep. The next morning, everything was dead quiet when I got up and made coffee. I went outside to urinate. There were no birds chirping or chittering. It was so quiet that it was eerie, but I finished and I went inside to have my coffee and get dressed. It was feeling like snow in the air, and I wanted to bring in a bunch of firewood. And I dressed and put my pistol into its holster and went out back to the woodpile. I had made 3 or 4 trips, and when I came back out the last time and stepped off the porch, I caught fast movement behind the outhouse. It was fast enough that I thought it had to be a crow or something. I got a few steps further and it stepped out from behind the outhouse, and I stopped dead still, looking right at a Bigfoot. I am 6'4" tall, and this big bastard had at least a foot on me. It was so thick and muscular, it looked like a brownish red bodybuilder. It was just so massive, there was no other way to describe it. If I had to make a guess, there was no way it could have weighed less than 750 pounds. 3 times what I weighed at 250. Hell, it was probably more because of its sheer massive width. It had no whites to its eyes, and the nose was really wide and flat. The face looked like a flatter version of a gorilla, but with a human-like nose and really thick, large cheekbones, and a heavy brow above its deep-set black eyes. It didn't have the pronounced muzzle of a gorilla, but rather more like a human, but with a massive and thick lower jaw in the same way the nose was more human-like than gorilla. Similar, but still distinct. I can see it just as clearly now as in the moment I was looking at it. It had a conical head, or at least a big tuft of hair on top of its head that made it appear conical, but there was no length to its neck. The head sat so low, it gave the impression that it sat directly on its shoulders. I think I said, "Oh shit," or I dropped the F-bomb. Well, then it sniffed the air and it looked at me and it went, "Oomph," again. Not threatening per se, just almost like questioning me. I really don't know. The impression on me was like when a dog woofs at you. It's not barking like it's scared or threatening, but like, "I'm here and I'm not sure how I feel about you yet." I was only 10 yards from it. It could just reach out and grab me with one step forward from where it stood rocking on its thick legs. It moved just a little more to its left side, like it was deciding which way to run. But then it looked at me again with a change in expression, like it was deciding what to do to me now instead of running. We both stood there staring at one another. Now, I've had subjects look at me that way, pursuant to an arrest. The change in its expression was a pre-assaultive cue, and I recognized it for what it was. I put my right hand under my fleece vest and I grabbed my pistol, thinking that if that big bastard moved toward me an inch, I was going to put 16 rounds into its chest as fast as I could, and then reload while I was making a run for the cabin. When I put my hand on my gun, it let out a different noise that went through my chest like a loud bass beat. It was a "Mwah" that cracked at the end. It looked like it grew 6 inches taller, and we stared at one another for a few seconds, and then it looked off to its left and it ran into the woods, crashing through the brush. It moved faster than I thought something that big could move. I don't know how long I stood there. It seemed like hours, but it could only have been a few seconds. I drew my pistol to low ready and back sidestepping and scanning around me all the way to the cabin. My heart was pounding when I got back inside, and I was adrenaline pumping so bad that I was shaking. I locked the door, which in retrospect seemed silly because it was just a wooden door with a large window in it and an old deadbolt that wouldn't stop anyone who wanted to get in. I had no idea what I should do. I only knew what I could do. I reverted to my training and made sure the old Remington pump shotgun we kept in the cabin was loaded with slugs. I pulled the 30-30 out of the rack and levered a round into the chamber, and then I loaded another round into the magazine to top it off. I made sure the shotgun was close at hand wherever I was for the rest of that day, and made damn sure I was back inside by dark and had the kitchen light and back porch and front porch lights on. I tried to sleep, but I only dozed lightly because every sound brought me to full wakeness. I even traded my bed by the window for one of the couches that was backed up to the solid log wall, and I even remained dressed with my boots on. I knew it could get in, but it would have to make a hell of a lot of noise doing it, and that would at least give me a reactionary gap to shoot it a bunch of times before it really got pissed off and ate me or whatever it planned to do. Either way, if it got me, I would be surrounded by empty shotgun shells and 10mm brass. Now, I know it sounds like I'm making light of it, but those were the thoughts that went through my head. It was the cops' gallows humor at work. Grandpa showed up in the morning before Uncle Mick and the rest. I helped him unload his blazer and we went inside for coffee. He asked me why the shotgun was on the kitchen counter and the whole incident spilled out of me. He sat there with his hands around his coffee cup looking into it and then looked up into my eyes and said, "I know." Grandpa and I looked all around the cabin area for tracks. The leaf and pine needle cover was so thick, and other than a couple of large, poorly defined impressions where it stood facing me, there was nothing that had any detail. If I hadn't been right there to see it, I wouldn't even know what the impressions and the clutter were or even pay them any mind at all. I think I was really looking for any evidence that I hadn't totally lost my mind. I wasn't prone to unreasonable fear at work, and I was used to dealing with predatory humans and high stress and high threat situations and gangs and narcotics. I'd been in critical incidents and I had handled them. I was rattled that I was so rattled. Yes, it was a Bigfoot, but it was also just a flesh and blood animal. I was raised around animals and I worked around predators. It didn't make sense that this would affect me the way it did. There was a big part of me that wanted to pack it in and head back down to the Flint area and spend the next 2 weeks with my grandma instead of staying at the cabin. There was also the part of me that wouldn't let a big monkey chase me out of a place where I had spent so much good time with my grandpa. You can call it ego or self-image. Wanted to be able to look at myself in the mirror and not see a coward. And all those things made me stay and made me go out in the woods and hunt like I always had. I was definitely more alert to anything out of the ordinary, and most especially, I was alert to sudden deafening silence, but nothing else happened. I even forced myself to stay out until dusk so I would have to make part of the walk from my blind to the cabin in the dark. Now, I'm not so arrogant as to say that I was scary to a Bigfoot, but 30 years of reflecting on the incident and going over it and reading other accounts by people whom I consider to be credible, I have become convinced that it was when it saw me open my vest and put my hand on my pistol that it decided to run. Yes, it had to have seen and heard me shoot earlier. It made noise and alerted me to the presence of what I thought was someone messing with me, but it saw and it heard the guns. I had my pistol under my vest, so it didn't see a gun until I put my hand on it, and that's when its demeanor changed again, and it ran. I got a nice 6-point on the 17th. Grandpa and Uncle Mick and Uncle Jim all got a deer as well. But nothing else happened, and Grandpa and I didn't talk about it anymore until a few years later when he came to visit me in Arizona. He told me that he had also been alone at the cabin in the mid-70s when he saw something big and dark brown cross the road as he was driving out. It turns out that was our last trip to the cabin. It nearly burned down in a wildfire the following summer. Grandpa and Uncle Mick decided to sell the land and hunt with friends in another location after that. As of June of this year, I hadn't been back to the old property for almost 30 years. I had to go to Michigan for a family reunion, and I drove up with my wife, and on a whim, I decided to go back to the old property. It looked completely different going in. There were a lot of newer glamour cabins, and they had high-dollar water and trail toys and luxury SUVs parked around them. There wasn't anything left that I recognized on our old property. Everything, including how I felt about the place, had changed. But I was glad I had my 45 on my belt just the same. And then the writer adds, sorry for the long post, but there it is. And I thought this story was longer, but looks like I copied this thing twice and pasted it in my Word file. Anyway, that's the end of it. I got about halfway through the file and I thought, is that the end of it? That is the end of it. He said, sorry for the long post, but there it is. First and foremost, this man can write. I read the first paragraph when I pulled his email up, and I could tell right away that he had written this pretty good, and I would probably be able to read it cold. And that's what I did. I had never read this before. I just read it. First time I've ever seen it, I just read it straight off. But this is a really good, detailed, to me, a skeptic, this is a rational and believable story. I mean, he's in a really secluded place in Michigan. I think Michigan has huge wildernesses, and it's a beautiful place, especially in the summertime. I wouldn't want to be up there in the winter. But I'm a warm weather person. Anyway, he's up there in the wilderness, and he's very secluded, and he's hearing this stuff. And just by chance, he walks out, and boom, there's a Bigfoot just standing there. I mean, that's the perfect encounter. Would the Bigfoot have kept going? Would it have moved off had he not reached for his handgun? Or would it have stayed? Would it have just checked him out? Would it have attacked him? There's no way to know. He wasn't going to take a chance, and that makes sense to me. This is one of the better stories that I've read in a long time, and I really enjoyed reading it. So to the writer, you get an A for writing a story that I was able to read. I never got hung up on it at all. Sometimes I get hung up in these paragraphs because some people, they write like they think, and I don't think the same way. That doesn't mean the way they wrote it is wrong. It's just that the words that they use don't jive with the way I think, so I get hung up on it. Not this one. Man, I just blew through this like nothing. So I'm sorry, I'm just rambling, but I'm just so happy to get this story. So thank you to the writer. That's going to be it for this podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and we will see you soon on another podcast. We're going to be slowly increasing the rate of uploads after my work marathon, and I'm so excited to be doing this. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you guys on the next one. Thanks.